We'll go ahead and get started. As you know, we make these very concise meetings, a lot of really important information shared in a tight little platform, hopefully while you're taking a little break from your day. Thank you again for joining us. As I said, this is the first of the Corporate Partner Series for 2025. And we're very happy for you to join us. We are Earthshare North Carolina, if you haven't joined us before. And our whole role within the environmental community is to inspire and provide opportunities for people and corporations to actively participate in work for healthy and sustainable communities across North Carolina. And we do this by giving people opportunities to learn and directly engage with the work of our member nonprofit organizations. Um, One of those is on the line with us today, North Carolina Coastal Federation. Um, so, as part of the Corporate Partner Series, as I said, this is the first talk in a series of five that we'll be having throughout the year. Um, you can see there the dates and the presenters, and we are filling in the April presenter. As soon as it's known, you might recognize that is right around Earth Day, and so a little bit busier time than most. But we still want to be here with you all at that especially important time to be recognizing the importance of taking care of our environment. You can use the QR code there or the link to Luma to get yourself registered for those presentations. We can move on to the next slide and just share that um, if you are not our primary contact for your company, I'll just share that you're on this call because you are a corporate partner. And that means your company has decided to be a part of the Earthshare North Carolina network of organizations. And so we do have a variety of ways that we want to bring you, not just our primary contacts, but anyone in the company who wants to be part of the Corporate Partner Series taking place now, but also other programs that are coming up are the Corporate Earth Day events program and NC Climate Week. I hope you'll keep those things on your radar, and there's the QR code if you want to check those out as well. So, without further ado, the highlight of our call today is to hear from Erin Fleckenstein, the Oyster Program Director for North Carolina Coastal Federation. Um, Shared with Erin prior to the call, I am only at a surface level aware of all of the work that our nonprofit members are doing in very specific areas. And so the oyster rehabilitation and program is one that um, I have admired from that surface level for some time, and I'm really excited to have the opportunity to dig deeper in my understanding of this program. Erin will share all about it, and so I won't do too much of an intro, but we'll share that Erin works with over 30 entities to manage the Oyster Blueprint program, which is just an amazing demonstration of collaboration across the nonprofit community and organizations that are part of our Share North Carolina's nonprofit group and others. So with that, I will hand it over to Erin and thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Glad to be here. Glad that we're part of your nonprofit partnership opportunities. Let me just pull up my slides here real quick. All right. Are we at the beginning? Can you all see that okay? So, um, as Heather said, I'm Erin Fleckenstein with the North Carolina Coastal Federation. I oversee our oyster program for the Federation. For those of you that aren't entirely familiar with the Coastal Federation, we're a nonprofit focusing on the coastal areas of the state. Our tagline is to work together for a healthy coast. And so we really rely on a lot of collaborations and partnerships to achieve our goals around improving water quality, coastal marshes, and oysters in particular. We also have a coastal management policy division of the organization, as well as an education and outreach component as well. And all of those are pulled together under the banner of the Coastal Federation. So I oversee our oyster program for the Federation, and we're going to talk about one element of it today, our shell recycling program. And so the title of this presentation is Shuck, Slurp, and Save Shells, How You Can Recycle for Reefs. So if you can't tell from the title, we encourage you to enjoy North Carolina oysters, but just make sure that you are saving your oyster shells. So a little bit of background about the value and importance of our oyster population. Oysters, sorry, I'm trying to move my photo out of the way so I can see my slides entirely. Oysters, we call this the three F's of oysters, now expanding to four F's and a C. But basically, these are the values and importance that we put on oysters for the state and for the environment. But oysters are providing food, not just for us as humans, but also many of the animals and critters that live in our sounds and bays that make it their home. Oysters provide filtration of water in the sound. So one adult oyster can filter up to 50 gallons of water a day. It's a lot of water. I don't know if you guys have heard of the hard 75, but it's a task where you're supposed to drink a gallon of water a day, and drinking 1 gallon of water a day for me as a human is quite challenging. So I can't really imagine drinking 50 gallons of water a day and filtering it, but that's what our little bivalve friends do. They're also very important at providing fish habitat for other species. So the reef structures themselves are creating homes. They may not be as colorful and beautiful as our coral reefs in the more tropical areas, but oyster reefs are providing that same benefit to the sound. 75% of all fish species spend some portion of their life in our sounds and bays. And so they make use of oyster habitat for a large portion of their refuge needs. Where oyster reefs are located close to our shorelines, they also help provide flood control and erosion control. They are also very important to our culture and heritage. The harvesting of oysters has been an important part of coastal heritage since pre-European colonization, and it continues to be an important part of the coastal culture and heritage to this day. Unfortunately, 85% of our oyster reefs have been lost globally. And this is a study that was done by Beck et al. In 2011, looking at the historic range of oyster reefs throughout the world and identifying where oyster reefs are in good, fair, poor, or functionally extinct condition. And you can see that unfortunately, a large portion of the world's oyster population falls into that category of poor or functionally extinct. The story is no different here in North Carolina. Studies locally done have shown that we've lost 88% of the actual reef structure and biomass of our oyster reefs, therefore losing about 85% of that filtration capacity that our oysters provide for us, and about 90% of oyster harvest has been lost. This quote from Brumbaugh et al. In 2010, I think sums it up nicely. Oysters and oyster reefs are the most imperiled marine habitat on Earth. So not a whole lot of positivity to start out with, but we're talking now about what's being done to improve the situation and we're seeing some great success. The great thing about oysters is that if you build it, they will come. So if you give baby oysters a place to land on and grow, they can attach to that hard substrate and grow into a new oyster reef. And so what you're seeing in this picture is the oyster life cycle. On the very bottom is an adult oyster reef. And as you move to the left, around the circle, you'll see the oysters spawning and releasing their unfertilized eggs and sperm into the water. This is called broadcast spawning. The eggs are fertilized in the water, and once the egg is fertilized, it then floats for a period of 2 weeks. And during that time, the egg goes through a number of evolutions, of transformations, going into all these different scientific stages, life cycle stages that I won't quiz you on. But eventually, it gets to a point at this petaveloger stage, like right here at 2 o'clock, if you look at this as a clock. And at that petaveloger stage, the oyster develops a foot and an eye. And although it's not a foot like your foot or an eye like our eyes, the foot does provide a structure, a mechanism for the oyster baby to feel its way around a little bit. And the eye is photosensitive, so it helps the oyster move either up or down in the water column to find a place to land on. So once it has developed this foot and eye, it is ready to find its permanent home. And it will use that foot to then stick onto another oyster shell or hard substrate that's in the water, and then it grows up into its own new adult oyster. So just real briefly through the life cycle, those baby oysters, which we call spat, need a hard surface to land on and grow. They prefer to grow on other oysters. And recycled shell is used to be that substrate where we don't have existing oyster reefs. We are putting recycled shell in strategic places to provide that place for baby oysters to land on and grow. And then this is what that looks like. You can see the person in this photograph is holding a piece of recycled shell, and on that shell are 3 new baby oysters that have landed on here and are starting to grow their own new shells to become a new oyster reef. And so this is sort of the summation of our project here is taking these discarded oyster shells, placing them back in the water, so in those strategic locations so that they can grow up and form these new adult oyster reefs. So all of this has caused us to create a program that we call the Recycle for Reefs program as a way of branding and encouraging shell recycling in the state of North Carolina. A brief history of shell recycling in the state. In 2003, the state launched its own program, Chuck Your Shucks, and oyster shell recycling program for the state. It was launched by the State Division of Marine Fisheries in partnership with other nonprofits, including the Nature Conservancy and the Coastal Federation, among others, to collect oyster shell and place it back in the water in those strategic locations. In 2007, the General Assembly passed a statute banning oyster shells from landfills, making it illegal to dispose of shells in landfills, and also banning the use of oyster shells in commercial landscaping activities. So not using it for mulch, if you will, around flower beds and what have you. Unfortunately, in 2013, the General Assembly cut the funding for the program, so the state continued with some grants for the next 5 years, sort of continuing to collect shell and recycling as they could. At that point, the Federation stepped in and said, we're going to help with shell recycling. This is too important of a program to not continue. And so in 2018, we rebranded and launched the pilot program of Recycle for Reefs. This has moved to a focus of just collecting shell, mostly on the coastal areas of the state. And to this date, we now manage 28 public drop-off sites and collect from 27 different restaurants. So there's a variety of ways that we are collecting shell, everything from dumpsters to dump trailers, garbage cans, open bins, dump trailers, etc. So these are all the different ways that we are collecting shell up and down the coast. And we have a number of those public shell recycling locations. Um, you can see these little icons and logos are showing you where those recycling locations are. And we have a map on our website, nccoast.org. If you do nccoast.org/shell recycling, it will bring you to this map, to a webpage that has this map, and you can find a recycling location near you. We are pleased to announce that we have two new recycling locations in the Triangle area. We just visited them earlier this week, and local seafood at their East Raleigh Market location and Earp Seafood Market have now agreed to be collection points for our shell recycling activities. And they both have capacity to collect shell from the public. We have a number of restaurants that are also participating in shell recycling. Many of them are located on the coast, on the Outer Banks and the Wilmington-Wrightsville Beach area, and a few new locations in the Raleigh Triangle area, Angus Barn, 42nd Street Oyster Bar, and Stanberry. So with our restaurant partners, we're working with their oyster shuckers and their servers to collect shell, discarded shell. So they are, with the sort of increase in oyster consumption that we're seeing in the state, the shells are collected from the restaurants and then brought to our curing and stockpile locations where they're given an opportunity to cure for about 6 months before we place them back in the water. And those shells are used in a variety of restoration projects. We've partnered with the Division of Marine Fisheries, so we've got kind of two avenues, if you will, for restoration. The first one is that top line where that stockpile of shell is used in a more sort of larger commercial scale, if you will, restoration project, working with our heavy machinery and equipment's front-end loaders to load the shell onto barges, taking it out into the water and placing it on a designated and permitted reef restoration project site, eventually growing up into an adult oyster reef. Or alternatively, we have some smaller patch reef locations that are accessible in shallower waters where we work with local partners, including the Nature Conservancy and our volunteers to place that shell back in the water. And you can see the creativity of taking that shell, shoveling it, placing it into a kayak, walking it out to the reef restoration site, and then putting it into those strategic locations. We've developed a number of communications materials around Recycle for Reefs. This one in particular is what we're using for a lot of our communications purposes, encouraging people to enjoy North Carolina oysters, but making sure that we recycle those shells so that they can be used in our reef restoration projects. And then these projects or these communication materials include a QR code to find that drop-off location and make sure that the shells get back in the water. So things that you can do to help is to enjoy North Carolina oysters, but make sure that you recycle your shells at a public drop-off location. Supporting restaurants that recycle shells. So that list of restaurants, we encourage you to participate or to frequent them and let them know that you appreciate their involvement and their efforts. They are taking on this extra effort to collect and recycle the shell with their existing staff and making it a part of their culture of their restaurant and showing that it's a priority for them. You're encouraged to come and volunteer at any one of our reef building activities up and down the coast. We have an Adopt an Oyster program where you can adopt an oyster and watch it through its life cycle, going from the collection to in-water restoration, and then learning about how it is doing on its restoration site. You can join the Coastal Federation as a member, and you can encourage your businesses to sponsor the Coastal Federation. So with that, I will stop sharing and would love to answer any questions that you might have about recycling oyster shells. Oh, I see we have questions in the chat here. Okay.
There's a question here asking why the shells need to cure.
Yeah, so the idea is that there is, extra meat that's left on the shells, and there's potential for bacteria and other things to be on the shells. And so we leave them in the sun for a period of at least 6 months to allow that UV degradation and any bacteria that might be on the shells to be, handled by the UV degradation so that it's safe to put the shell back in the water and we're not introducing any pathogens into the water when we are building these new oyster reefs. Great question. Are the
Ah,
shells infinitely recyclable, reusable? Um, Well, yes and no. I mean, the calcium carbonate from the shell is recycled in the water column, so in that way, that the shell is being recycled permanently. But the shell itself, like if you just put a piece of shell material in the water, it has a half-life, if you will, of about 10 years. So without new calcium carbonate being laid down on the shell by the live oyster, the shell will start to dissolve and decompose. And we're seeing that to be about a 10-year lifespan for the shell before um, it starts to break down into smaller fragments. Right. If it's illegal to throw them away, but there aren't drop-off locations, how can people do anything? Well, we are working to expand shell recycling, and we have a request into the legislature currently to fund an expansion of the shell recycling program. Um, it is unfortunate that it is illegal to throw them away, but there is no enforcement and there is little opportunity to comply with the law. So we are working to actively expand shell recycling opportunities to be able to fill that need. And having voices that help echo that message is also really valuable and important. Saying that, we're seeing while we're collecting on the coast, because that's where the Coastal Federation's offices are, we're seeing larger consumption of oysters in our, bigger metropolitan areas like the Triangle and further west, where there's, a foodie culture. And so we're working to expand and Charlotte, Asheville area, working to expand shell recycling opportunities as we move further west. Can shells from anywhere in the world be recycled in North Carolina waters? So maybe I need some clarification on that question. Are you talking about you've gone on vacation and you've collected shells in other areas and you want to put them back in the water? Or are we talking about West Coast shells coming to North Carolina waters? Maybe a little clarification would help on that question. But we do accept mussel shells and clam shells in the oyster shell recycling piles. Um, and and so those would be definitely acceptable. That's another reason, for the curing process, if the shells are being introduced from other waters, wanting to make sure that we're allowing that time for degradation and die off of any potential pathogens that might be introduced from other waters. Reach out to local grocery store chains to help collect and spread awareness. Yes, that's great ideas about how to expand the shell recycling opportunities. Restaurants serve shells from parts of the US.
I think that's a follow-up on the question
Oh,
about taking shells from other states and locations.
I see. So you're saying that you're importing oysters from other states and then they're serving those in the local restaurants. Yes, we would collect those oyster shells and be able to use them in the reef building activities. Are all the shells collected recycled? All the shells that are collected at these locations, yes, are recycled, with the exception of sometimes we see a lot of contamination, unfortunately, because of uh, you know, these shells being consumed either at restaurants or in not really our restaurant partners. But maybe there's an event that someone has and they have a number of, the little plastic cups or maybe gloves. We see all sorts of interesting trash that gets mixed in with the oyster shell. And so to some degree, we can pull that trash out. But if there's a commingled pile that is like half trash, half shell, it's just not possible for us to go through and pull all of the material out of those piles. But I would say in general, yes, every bit of shell that is collected is used in our reef building activities. So we work with the Division of Marine Fisheries to build reefs. Like I said, we work with partners like Audubon and the Nature Conservancy, as well as our own Coastal Federation projects use loose oyster shell in them. And so we do try to get every bit of that shell back in the water for it to build new oyster reefs. Can't keep up with where we are on the list of questions anymore. That's great.
This one have oyster shells that are placed in bags and on shorelines as erosion prevention. What is your take on that strategy?
Yeah, so Oyster, that has been a very effective strategy at creating a little, these shells weigh very little when they are dry. And so placing them in bags helps to provide some weight to allow the shells to provide more stability along the shoreline. Um, as an organization, it's a very helpful tool to be able to create these bags of oyster shell and engage the public in reef building activities. We have moved away from using bags as much because of the plastic concerns in the water. We're looking at alternatives like basalt bags and bags made with potato starch, as well as other forms that use like a concrete that embeds the oyster shell in the concrete, but it's still a lightweight enough material that can be placed in the water for reef building activities using volunteers. In areas where we have low wave energy, we can use those lighter weight materials for our shoreline erosion practices. Yes.
Well, I'm going to pause here. We have one more minute and three more questions. And so I'll ask Erin, do you have time to take these three more questions?
Sure.
Okay. And for our others, anyone who needs to go ahead and hop off at 12:30 on the dot, thank you for being here. Please plan to come to the next presentation in April. Yes, and you're welcome to hop off if you need to. So, gonna go to Michael's question. Do any oyster suppliers take shells back?
Yes, so we have had some great success with shucking houses. So the seafood markets based or the shucking houses that are receiving larger volumes of oyster shell, they will shuck the meat and keep the shell, and they have understood that it is now, a commodity that can be used in these reef building activities. And so they have been very successful. And this idea of working with oyster suppliers such as ERPs and locals and some of our other coastal seafood markets is exactly what we're trying to capitalize on, where the customer is purchasing their oysters from a seafood market, and then they know that they can bring it back to that seafood market for recycling purposes. And so that is, very much part of our strategy to help collect and recycle the oyster shells.
Um, can the contaminated shells be used for something else, shore erosion or any other?
Yeah, again, we'd have to remove all of the trash. So we would need some sort of system by which we could effectively and easily remove the trash. Right now, we have part-time staff that are tasked with other responsibilities that are, collecting the shell and managing it. And if they have to spend 2 days picking trash out of a pile, it's not really an effective use of their time. So we would definitely want to use the shell, but finding another way to make sure it is clean and free of litter before it is put in the water would be an important thing.
Yeah. All right, one more question from the chat, and then I hope I can ask one final question of you. So from Jill Randolph, are you aware of oyster restoration efforts in those parts of the world where they're mostly gone?
I'm sure there might be some reef and shell recycling activities in Europe, but I'm not aware of them per se. I am definitely familiar with other recycling programs here in the US, and there are programs up and down the coast, on the East Coast and West Coast. This is definitely a priority um, for many organizations that are working on restoring coastal habitats to collect and recycle oyster shells.
Great.
Mhm.
Well, my question is on the topic of encouraging restaurants to be restaurants that recycle their oyster shells. Is there an action that the general public can take in that that maybe a company could invite their employees to share with restaurants? So, is there any organized effort around doing kind of that local restaurant advocacy?
Yeah, I would love for there to be some more. I think Kelly put it into the chat as well as, it's sort of the chicken or the egg, right? As far as our staff limitations and funding limitations, because we have to be able to support the logistics of that shell collection.
Mhm.
And it takes, both financial and human power to collect that shell and make it back to the water. So we're cautiously moving forward. We don't want to overpromise and underdeliver. So one of the big factors that we look at reaching out to the restaurants that we're working with is the volume of shell that they are actively purchasing and willing to recycle. So that I would say yes. We have done we just finished an assessment this past year looking at restaurants along the coast as well as in the Triangle area, and we've sort of developed our top 10 list, if you will, as far as the next restaurants and businesses that we're going to be approaching to encourage them to participate in shell recycling. And it's largely based on the volume of shell that they are consuming and generating at this point.
Well, I'll issue an invitation to you all then when you're ready to move forward with that top 10 list to let us know and we can share it and support it in whatever way is helpful to you
Thank
all.
you.
Um, Thank you so much, Erin, for your time. To everyone else who took the time and came on the call today. It looks like there's so many ideas and questions that are probably still out there for you, Erin. So maybe we'll find a way to have you back again for part two. But everyone, have a great day. Join us again in April. Bye.
Thank you.